I'd like to hand over to Professor Allen to speak on carbon takeback, how we will stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all very much indeed for coming. Particular thanks to those whose faces have become familiar over the past 3 years, and the ones who've been coming to lots of these lectures. Particular shout out to my dad, who's made almost all of them. Well done. And absolutely, it deserves that. In fact, another family member, our 19-year-old son, can't make it this evening, and he was in the kitchen last night. He was saying, so what's changed since you started giving these Gresham lectures? I was like, Well, the world's got about 1/10 of a degree warmer, getting on for 1/10 of a degree warmer. We've experienced our first year with temperatures above 1.5 degrees. Carbon dioxide and methane emissions have gone up. We're seeing the price of gas in Europe, this is a relevant one, has gone down by around 40 euros a megawatt hour. And we're seeing parties promising to make their sort of one of their main planks of policy to abolish all climate policies gaining ground across Europe and Britain and the United States. So, I'd like to start on an optimistic note. And this is worth remembering, because I get lots of people asking me, so we've missed 1.5 degrees, is it too late? And my reply to this is, it's always been true that we could stop global warming in a generation. And we could do it without spending a penny of taxpayers' money or giving reform anything to whinge about in 2029. And that would limit all future warming to less than's happened since the 2000s. Would it mean we'd meet the Paris Agreement goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees? Barely, but frankly, it'd be a good result. We could do it, but we're not doing it, because it requires a radical new approach to climate policy. Or at the very least, a complementary policy to the ones we had at the moment. I know I've got colleagues who say, no, don't say new climate policy because they'll just shut down and won't want to listen to you because everybody's so fond of the policies they already have. But it is important to be realistic that the policy package we have isn't working. Emissions are still going up. Globally, we've been saying, one more heave will get us over the line for a long time now. And I think it's important to be realistic about it, even though that can be quite a painful conversation. We saw this, Lindy Fersman is here, we saw this very graphically when the Tony Blair Institute released their report to say climate policy is not working, and they were right. And everything in the report was entirely reasonable, and yet everybody went completely ballistic on both sides. It's very difficult to have these conversations. So, to make the conversation easier, I'd like you to think about the world a decade after we achieve net zero. Okay? So at some point in the future, I'm not going to tell you when, but carbon dioxide emissions, global carbon dioxide emissions are net zero or below. Methane and nitrous oxide emissions are well down. The world is no longer warming. Weather is no longer changing. Sea levels are still rising. And of course, the climate impacts of the past climate change are still with us, but global warming is history. Wow. Now, can you imagine, or do you imagine, in that world, our post-net zero world, is anyone, anywhere in the world, using fossil fuels to fly planes or drive heavy trucks, or burning limestone to make cement? If your answer is no, then you really are a pessimist. Because even in the most optimistic climate scenarios, we are still using fossil fuels well out to 2100 and beyond. Oil consumption does go down, depends very much on the scenario. All of these scenarios behind me are the 1.5 degree scenarios of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So these are the success scenarios. And this is oil use in those scenarios. Of course, it goes down, but it doesn't go to zero. Gas is even more all over the place. Goes down about to the level it was back in 1990. Many scenarios, it even goes up. Coal is the one which has a very clear pattern here. Coal usage does stop soon in any scenario because basically coal is no longer economic anyway. Of course, enthusiasts for renewable energy find these scenarios annoying, and they say, well, no, these scenarios are out of date. They've got out-of-date cost assumptions. As soon as you finish the scenario, cost of renewables is coming down all the time. Yes, but they're out of date in another way as well. I mean, coal usage is not declining. And if you look carefully at these scenarios, it declines precipitately from 2020 onwards. So yes, we may make renewable energy cheaper in the future than is in the models behind these scenarios, but that might just have to compensate for the fact that we are a bit late phasing out coal. So we have to, and the climate policy community as a whole has to, and this is a big challenge for lots of people, get its mind around the fact that we've got to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming before the world stops using fossil fuels. And let's think about the implications of that for a bit. That's the carbon dioxide that's generated from fossil sources in these 1.5 degree scenarios. As you can see, of course, a big part of achieving net zero is that we burn less by replacing fossil fuels with wind, solar, and so on, the familiar measures that you're and that means, these are big numbers. We burn a lot less, 2 to 3 trillion tons of carbon dioxide that we avoid producing by 2100. But we also, and the next biggest thing that happens in these scenarios to meet the goal of the Paris Agreement is that we increase from zero today, or effectively zero today, massively by mid-century, the amount of carbon dioxide we pump back underground. These blue lines here are carbon dioxide disposal, geological carbon dioxide disposal, capturing carbon dioxide, liquefying it, and pumping it back down into the Earth's crust in order that it doesn't end up in the atmosphere. And we store, again, on average, you can see it's a big range, but around 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide restored to the geosphere, put back where it came from by the end of the century. And if you have to ask me what's the single biggest challenge in meeting our climate goals, it's that one. How are we going to get rid of 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide? 1 trillion is sort of like a mind-bogglingly big number. But the point being, carbon dioxide it's a very inert gas. You can't burn this stuff. That's the point. It's in lowest energy form. The only way we know of today to get rid of it on this kind of scale is capturing it, compressing it, and re-injecting it back underground. There are other ideas out there. We could dispose of it by sort of the ocean geochemical ways of disposing of it, by sort of realkalinizing the oceans. But they have, other environmental considerations to think about and to worry about. There's ideas about turning it back into rock. Again, these are all relatively new ideas. The only way we know that we know we can do this is by putting it back underground. There is, of course, a role for stopping deforestation and reversing it. So right now, we're putting 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year from deforestation. We've got to turn that around and start to restore our biosphere. And that means, that would address, remove around slightly less than 500 billion tons of carbon dioxide restored to the biosphere. But again, it's worth remembering these numbers. 2 to 3 trillion tons avoided CO2 production, 1 trillion tons put away back underground, less than 500 billion tons in reversing deforestation. And the reason it's worth emphasizing is because lots of people like to talk about storing carbon in the biosphere, planting trees as a solution to climate change. Yes, it's a very important one, but it's only a small part of the problem. And of course, as the climate changes, any carbon stored at the Earth's surface is vulnerable both to climate change itself, with increased forest fire risk and so on, and also to the pressure for land for food and bioenergy production in the future. So, we know what a durable net zero looks like. It's geological net zero. It means a like-for-like balance between any carbon dioxide we still produce from geological sources, like fossil fuels or burning limestone to make cement, and geological sinks, capturing it and putting it back into the geosphere, back into the solid earth, back underground. And we achieve geological net zero in the scenarios that meet the goals of the Paris Agreement soon after mid-century. I don't have to be that precise about it, depends on the scenario, but that's sort of around the time scale at which we do this. And the scientific consensus that this is what it takes to stop global warming is very high. We just published a paper earlier this year where we got the band back together again, so to speak, of all of the authors of the 6 net zero papers that were published back in 2009. This happens sometimes in science, that lots of different groups ended up arriving at the same conclusion and published within a few months of each other. And that was what happened in 2009. We had a bunch of papers came out, all of which came to basically the same conclusion, that 50 to 80% reductions in CO2 emissions wasn't going to be enough. We're going to have to get them all the way down to zero. And we were anxious, we, the authors of those papers, were anxious that net zero had sort of evolved a bit and come to mean something rather different from what we meant when we published those papers back then, and published a paper to say, look, you know, what you're calling net zero today isn't going to do what we said it would do back in. And if you remember the various Gresham lectures, you can probably remember why. But I won't reiterate all that now. I just want to stress that this need for geological net zero is universally accepted in the scientific community, but not a single company, not a single country has yet committed to geological net zero. Why? Well, perhaps because it just makes things too simple. It makes it very clear whether you've addressed the impact of your ongoing use of fossil fuels. And it's far cheaper, of course, just to hire a clever accountant to do some clever carbon accounting, particularly if your clever carbon accountant can take advantage of trees that are going to grow anyway. So it's, perhaps it just puts things into slightly too stark reality. And of course, the real problem with achieving geological net zero is getting rid of carbon dioxide safely and permanently back underground is not cheap. You know, very ballpark numbers, that's a bill of the order of $1 to $3 trillion per year. And, you know, whenever anybody starts talking about trillions of dollars, you should take it with a pinch of salt. But it's a lot of money in the second half of this century just to get rid of carbon dioxide. And, you know, there's really only, you know, ask who in that net zero world, who could pay for that? Who could possibly afford to pay to get rid of all that carbon dioxide? And it comes down to really only two options. It's very simple. Either the taxpayer pays, or the people who still benefit from the use of fossil fuels pay. Remember those red lines? They're still, well, you can see them behind me. They're well above zero. There's still plenty of people out there using fossil fuels in this world. And that's really the only choice you've got. Either the taxpayer pays or the industry and its customers pay. And any economist will tell you that it's generally a much better outcome if the people who benefit from an activity pay to clean up after themselves rather than just dumping the bill on the general taxpayer. That's sort of routine economists, the routine economists' view. Of course, everybody else, apart from the economists, would much prefer the taxpayer to pay, especially the industry. In fact, I once had somebody, pretty senior person in a fossil fuel company, which had just made, I think, annual profits rather larger than the budget of the NHS, told me, well, of course, carbon capture is a public good, so of course the public should pay for it. And he was completely serious. The idea that they would, no, it's not their carbon. They're not burning it. They're just selling it. It's doing no harm when it was in the petrol stations. It's the driver that goes and burns it. The problem is, and the difficulty is that they're getting away with that logic at the moment. I mean, basically, the only carbon that's going back underground is going there because taxpayers, either American or British or Norwegian taxpayers, are paying for it. And slight complication about the Norwegian, but never mind, we won't get into details. And of course, as we're seeing in the United States, any funding model that depends on taxpayer handouts, and the US has an extremely generous one introduced by the previous administration, it is vulnerable. I mean, it's sort of surviving just, and we do want those programs to continue, so everybody's a little bit edgy at the moment. But it's not a reliable way of building an industry that's got to last for decades if you're never quite sure what the next administration is going to do. So, and by the way, before we it's easy to look at the United States at the moment and sort of panic slightly. But I mean, remember, the bill for just the UK's share of that carbon dioxide disposal bill, when I sort of worked it out, what would the UK be paying? So 1 to 3 trillion over the whole world. What would the UK be paying for carbon? So if you look at the Climate Change Committee's scenarios, this is this independent group that looks at our net zero policy, they estimate that we could be paying up to £20 billion a year for carbon dioxide disposal by 2050. And if you do the maths, that's painfully close to £350 million a week. And I put it to you, whatever your views on Remain or Leave, membership of the European Union had much more tangible benefits than a carbon dioxide disposal program. You switch off your carbon dioxide disposal program, it'll be decades before anybody notices. Which means that it'll be very, very hard to keep people paying for it if you can, a Farage pops up every now and then saying, well, let's fund a few hospitals instead, just turn off the program. Now, the sort of conventional model of how we're going to get there is that the government won't pay for it in the end. Well, governments are paying for it at the moment. But so the conventional climate policy scenario is that we have a carbon tax, or in Europe, an emission trading scheme price. That's the price you pay to put CO2 into the atmosphere. And eventually that price rises high enough that you choose not to release your CO2 into the atmosphere, but you capture it and put it back underground instead. Or if you have to release it to the atmosphere, you pay someone else to recapture it from the atmosphere and put it back underground. So that's the sort of standard. If you ask pretty much anybody in DESNES how it's going to work, they'll tell you, of course, it'll work this way. Because we have an ETS price, it'll go up, it'll go higher than the cost of carbon dioxide disposal, everybody will start disposing of their carbon dioxide, and all will be well. There are problems with this. First of all, people don't like paying carbon taxes or ETS charges. Ask Jim Ratcliffe, who's grumbles a lot about the fact that he has to pay an awful lot for his emissions when he runs a factory in the UK, doesn't have to pay a penny if he moves that factory to Southeast Asia, for example. Ask Mark Carney, who just had to abolish Canada's carbon tax in order to get elected. There's a more subtle problem specifically for the carbon dioxide storage challenge, which is that if you just have a carbon price, then the cheapest way to avoid paying the carbon price is to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide you produce, so there's no incentive to actually build carbon dioxide capture and storage infrastructure, because generally there's a quicker and cheaper way of getting your emissions down in the short term. But then, and again, referring back to these to lectures that some of you may remember those cost curves of emission reductions, you sort of hit a wall at about 75% of our current emissions, where it becomes really expensive to actually eliminate those last activities, where you really need that carbon dioxide storage capacity in order to get rid of that remaining CO2, and you haven't built it. And that's what happens if you just sit and wait for the carbon price to do its thing. It'll be too little too late. We won't have this infrastructure built in time. And third, I think there's a philosophical problem with carbon pricing as well, because in effect, what a carbon price is doing is the government is charging you to emit. So the government gets a very handy source of revenue. In fact, there's a bit of a danger with carbon pricing that you create a weird incentive for the government to keep us addicted to fossil fuels in order to keep that tax revenue coming in. And you have all sorts of problems when we actually stop using fossil fuels, because suddenly they lose a huge source of tax revenue. But now, you could probably ways out of that problem, but the real problem is, if that's the settlement over the next 30 or 40 years, what happens after that? we're almost certainly going to put too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and need to take quite a lot of it back out again. And if the government has taxed us for emitting up until the date of net zero, then after the date of net zero, the only way you're actually going to get carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere is for the government to pay you to do it. That's the sort of logic of a carbon price, is it works both ways. So again, it locks you into a scenario in which the only entity that's actually paying for carbon dioxide disposal in the future after the date of net zero is the long-suffering taxpayer, who, and then you've got back into the problems with populists saying, let's just switch off the program and so on. So how else to pay for it? Well, I want to give you the Willie Sutton principle, which you may have heard of. Willie Sutton was an enterprising bank robber in the US, I know, back in the 30s. Here he is. And he was asked, why do you rob banks? And he answered, because that's where the money is. So if we're asking how to pay for geological CO2 disposal, we have to ask ourselves, where's the money? Now, this is a schematic from Stephen Peake of Open University. It's 2022, which was a kind of an odd year, but it does illustrate a very important point. So you can't see all the blobs. The black one is global, the big blue one is the world economy, okay? Total size of the world economy. The black one's total military spending, quite a big blob there. Working our way around, the amount we invest in energy, going around anti-clockwise from the military one. Then the net income of oil and gas producers, profits minus loss, revenues minus costs, oil and gas alone. Global corporate profits in total in 2020. The purple one, total tax revenue, so governments are doing better than companies, just about. Finally, the big orange one, the big yellow one at the top is the total amount we spend on new capital assets, so building bridges, roads, and everything all over the world. So that's a huge amount of money. Humans spend a lot on new capital assets every year. But the orange one is what we spent on energy in 2022. Okay, 2022 was an odd year, but it puts it into context. That's where the money is. It's bigger than total tax revenue. Well, in that year it was. It's now lower, but it's wobbling around. It's at that scale. And so if we're looking at where to find the money to pay for CO2 disposal, people assume it's going to come from here, from taxes. And what I'm saying is, there's another option. Think about it. So what I'd like you to imagine is a very simple act to deliver geological net zero with no new taxes or government subsidies, and nothing for anybody to whinge about in the short term. And it goes, the lawyers would have to work on the language, but it would go something like this. After 2050, you can't sell stuff in the UK that causes global warming. We've already decided that because we've got a net zero 2050 goal. So arguably, you don't even need to say this, but this is kind of reiterating the point. By the way, just to remind people, after 2050, you can't sell stuff in the UK that causes global warming. So if you're selling stuff in the UK right now that causes global warming, you've got 25 years to fix it. And to do that, you've got to capture and permanently store 1 tonne of carbon dioxide for every tonne generated by both your activities and the products you sell. And by the way, promising to stop selling that stuff in 2049 isn't good enough. There was a coal mine in Cumbria that Boris Johnson waved through because it was only licensed to 2049. I kid you not. Shows how seriously we take net zero policy. So, what do we mean by having 20 years to fix it? How could we tell if a company is serious about fixing their product versus just sort of punting the problem down the road and hoping for the best in 2049? Now, we can go back to our scenarios to ask what's a reasonable pathway to geological net zero. And there's a lot of attention at the moment, particularly in initiatives like the Science Based Targets Initiative, to ask, how can we tell if a company is serious about net zero or not? And the traditional method has been to look at these scenarios and sort of compare the company's actions with the scenarios. But that's increasingly difficult because, these scenarios, they look to me a little bit sort of like Wile E. Coyote. You're sort of running along, and suddenly you go off a cliff. So easy to say, well, the scenarios don't make any sense, so how can you compare my company with these scenarios and use that to rate what the company is doing? So, but what we can do is, without believing the absolute numbers that are coming out of these scenarios, and the other problem, of course, is there's a real spaghetti of lines here. You can't sort of see what's in common in 2030. You can see you've got scenarios where emissions are still higher than they are today, and there's other ones where they're down below a quarter of what they are today. So what's the prescription? People do things like taking an average and saying that's what a company should do. You wouldn't make other policies that way. But what we can do is look at these scenarios to see what have they got in common, because that might tell us something real about the real world. And so I'm going to ask you, I'm just taking exactly the same numbers, and I'm dividing blue by red, which gives purple. Okay? Believe me. Okay, so 1 minus the carbon dioxide stored over the carbon dioxide produced, okay, is the fraction of the carbon dioxide generated by continued use of fossil fuels that is left in the atmosphere, as opposed to being captured and permanently stored back underground. Don't worry, this is the only equation in this lecture. I know some other lectures had lots of equations, and forgive me for that, but this is the only one. But it's a pretty simple one. And if I plot these exact same scenarios in this way, it's the same information, it's just showing you this ratio. You can say, well, it hasn't really helped because they're still a bit all over the place. You see, there's still quite a big spread between them. But a lot of that is just because they start reducing at different times. So let's assume they all start at the same time and reach 5% early in the 2030s, which is what the industry says it's able to do. They're now all sort of bunched up at the beginning, but they still fan out because despite the fact these are all quite ambitious climate scenarios, they have different levels of ambition. So some reach net zero earlier than others and so on. And however, we can go one stage further and say, well, let's assume they all get halfway at the same time. So now I'm not plotting them by year, I'm plotting them as a fraction of the time elapsed to net zero. So if you look at the bottom axis here, it's 1 when you get to net zero, okay? And there's a bit of spread at the end, but suddenly you can see that sort of whole spaghetti of scenarios, you've sort of gathered them all together. They all make sense. And in fact, they've all got a very similar pattern. And the pattern which emerges it's a parabola. It's what a physicist would call a geodesic. It's a line of least resistance. It's the path that Galileo's cannonball would have taken if he'd just thrown it off the Leaning Tower of Pisa rather than dropping it. I don't even know if he dropped it, but and when you've done lots and lots of calculations and had lots of economists scratching their heads about these scenarios, and they all have the same shape in the end, then I think you've learned something about the world. And I think there is something profound here, that if you want to get to net zero, you've got to start bringing down this net geological carbon intensity of the fossil fuels you still use. And if you want to do it in a sensible way that doesn't involve, going off a cliff like Wile E. Coyote at the end, you've got to follow a very obvious path. Suppose we want to get to net zero by 2050. That's Britain's target. What does that mean? It means you've got to be capturing 4% of the carbon dioxide generated by the fossil fuels we still use in 2030, 16% in 2035, 36% in 2040. You can probably spot there's a pattern here. We can quiz you on what the formula is, but 64% in 2040 and 100% by 2050. So that's the pathway. So if you want to know, are you on track? Well, are you storing 4% or 16% in 5 or 10 years' time? Now, Britain actually, surprise, surprise, if we keep going on existing plans to build out our carbon capture and storage infrastructure, will be doing pretty well on this measure by the mid-2030s, if we actually get those plants implemented and we don't have any politicians popping up in 2029 saying, let's shut them all down because we want to spend the money on, something else instead. Of course, to get all the way to 100% by 2050, The carbon capture plants that we have planned at the moment, which will be capturing carbon dioxide, which is produced in factories and power stations and so on, will have to go beyond that and start recapturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That is possible. Indeed, the Oxy, the oil and gas company, is building a plant in Texas which will do just that, take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and re-inject it back underground. But of course, it's much more expensive. Which brings us to the crux of how to pay for this. So to illustrate how we could pay for geological carbon dioxide disposal, I'm going to show you a schematic produced by Stuart Jenkins, a colleague in Oxford, of the flow of carbon through our economy. So the blue arrows are either carbon dioxide itself or carbon that subsequently gets turned into carbon dioxide. So it's sort of equivalent carbon dioxide. So it comes into the economy either being pumped out of the North Sea, from under the North Sea, or imported, increasingly imported, either from the US or the Middle East. It goes to a refinery or a factory, it's made into products, they go on to consumers, and it all ends up in the atmosphere. Right now, climate policy is overwhelmingly focused on those industrial point sources. They're the ones who have to pay into our emission trading system. They're the Jim Ratcliffes of this world who are grumbling that their energy costs are high and they have to pay all these carbon charges. So they're feeling a bit grumpy. Consumers are confused. They don't really understand how climate policy is working for them. The atmosphere is sweating because it's all ending up in the atmosphere. Over in the top there, you've got a geological storage operator. This is somebody who set up a business to dispose of carbon dioxide, but they're sad and lonely because there's no arrows pointing towards them. Nobody has any business. There's no business case for doing what they're doing. The government's fast asleep, and the extractor importer is laughing all the way to the bank. So we introduce, the current funding model for how we pay for carbon dioxide capture and disposal in the UK and US is this one. The government just subsidizes it. The government turns a fire hose of money onto that geological storage operator. They buy their CO2 from wherever they can get it, probably from the industrial point source, and they start putting it underground. Okay, it gets things going. It gets these plants off the ground. So I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but, the geological storage operator, of course, is happy because they have a business, but the government's pretty cross. That's Rachel Reeves there, thinking, well, wait a minute, that's a lot of money. How can I avoid putting up taxes? Consumers are cross because they're paying those taxes, and the atmosphere is still sweating because it doesn't really make that much difference to the flow of CO2 into the atmosphere. The government can't afford to pay for that much carbon dioxide capture and storage. And the extractor importer, by the way, is still laughing. Okay. So another model is the emission trading system. So the government regulates those point sources, so they have to, their emission prices goes up so high, they have to pay the geological storage operator to get rid of their CO2. And they're now really cross and thinking of moving to somewhere else in the world where climate policy isn't nearly as onerous. So here's a third option. We introduce a small, what we call a carbon takeback obligation. This is a requirement on the extractor importer to produce some evidence that some carbon dioxide, a small fraction of the carbon dioxide that will be generated by the fossil fuels they wish to bring in and sell in the UK, has been captured and permanently disposed of. That, they have to get hold of something called a carbon storage unit, a certificate to say carbon dioxide has been got rid of, and the government requires them to do that. That's why all these arrows point at them. The government requires them to do that and checks that whoever is getting rid of that carbon dioxide actually has got rid of it, and that it's been permanently disposed of. What happens? Well, lots of interesting things happen if you do this. First of all, the industrial point source is maybe a little intrigued because they can sell their carbon dioxide now. They're not being charged for it. You see, the tables are turned. Carbon dioxide becomes a valuable product. Consumers are probably still confused because it's a new climate policy. Nobody really cares about climate policy, and plus, but the main thing is they're confused rather than angry because the amount were actually the size of the obligation is still small, so it wouldn't actually have that much impact on consumer prices. The atmosphere is still sweating, but the geological storage operator is now happy. The government has its nerd glasses on because it's learning how to do this, it's learning how to monitor, to report, verify, and do all these important things, which actually take quite a long time to really build the trust in these systems in order to do it. And the extractor importer is probably rather cross, because now they have a cost that they didn't have before. Well, I don't feel that bad for them. Over time, over a decade or more, we scale up that stored fraction, and now we have a new element has appeared. You'll notice that DAC operator, that's a direct air capture operator, the geological storage operator has run out of CO2. That's a good problem to have, okay? And they start to recapture it from the atmosphere. And this means now the price of CO2 has really got quite high. So the industrial point source is actually feeling pretty happy. And maybe Jim Ratcliffe is thinking of moving his chemical plants to the UK, because here he can sell his CO2 rather than shoving them off to the other side of the world where nobody pays him for his CO2. So what other climate policy can you think of which would actually encourage Jim Ratcliffe to bring assets to the UK and maybe leave him some money left over to buy better players for Manchester United? Who knows? Consumers are going to be still confused, fair enough, okay? But the atmosphere is feeling a little bit better because the net flow of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that's the carbon dioxide going in minus the carbon dioxide that's being taken out by the DAC operator, is going down. The geological storage operator is making serious money by this stage. It's become a very big business, getting rid of CO2. The government's still learning how to do things. And the extractor importer is perhaps sort of looking at the situation and thinking, well, you know, this maybe couldn't be quite so, maybe it's not quite so bad as we initially thought. Finally, we get to net zero, 100% stored fraction. You'll notice the thickness of the lines. I should have pointed this out. The thickness of the blue lines reflects the flow of carbon. So now you'll notice the flow of carbon into the economy is equal to the flow to the geological storage operator who's putting it back underground. Some of that's coming out of the air, some of it's coming out from point source capture, but the economy as a whole has achieved geological net zero. The industrial point source is happy because they're being paid for their CO2 rather than having to pay into the emission trading system. Consumers are happy, we hope, because we've stopped global warming. The atmosphere is breathing a sigh of relief. The geological storage operator is still making loads of money. The government's feeling awesome because it stopped global warming. And the extractor importer has saved the planet. If you think about it, it's not as far-fetched as it probably sounds. The economics of this are really quite intriguing. The cost of carbon capture, the red line behind me, maybe £50 a tonne right now. Not in the first-of-a-kind plants they're building, and certainly not if the government asks you how much would you like to store a tonne of CO2. Then it tends to be quite a lot, funnily enough. But I think the true cost of carbon capture is probably in that region at the moment, because we've got plenty of really cheap sources of carbon dioxide to capture. Really easy sources to capture because they're pure to start with. Makes it very... Now, of course, as those run out, as we ramp up that stored fraction, we're going to have to get closer and closer to just grabbing the carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. And then we're talking about a cost probably more in the region of £200 to £300 a tonne rather than 50. But of course, crucial to this policy is you start with a small fraction and it ramps up. So even in 2040, well over halfway to net zero, the stored fraction's only 36%. So you're only paying 36% of the cost of capture if you're a fossil fuel user. So the actual cost to the fossil fuel using economy of the UK is less than the current ETS price. So you could introduce this policy and, 15, 20 years before it actually gets as onerous as current climate policy. And if we look at it in the context of past fluctuations of fossil fuel prices, it looks even more possible. That's what it looks like. 60 pence on a litre of petrol over 25 years. If you look in more detail at this figure, the only one I've got detailed numbers on is the US one, but notice between 1997 and 2008, petrol prices went up. So in the US, you see the pure petrol price, so to speak, because there's very little tax, went up by about 60 pence a litre. Imagine if at the same time that he was making the Bank of England independent, Tony Blair had said, and we're going to stop climate change in a decade by requiring the fossil fuel industry to dispose of 1 tonne of CO2 for every tonne generated by the fossil fuels they bring into the UK. And that will make your petrol 60 pence a litre more expensive. Do you know what? I think he might have even got away with it. And we wouldn't have a problem anymore. We need to reimagine climate policy. And we need our politicians to be bolder in thinking outside the box of the kind of policies they've just gotten too used to trying to do a little bit more of over the years. The other crucial advantage of carbon takeback is it provides you with a natural route to carbon dioxide removal, to net carbon dioxide removal. Because instead of that reverse carbon tax I was talking about earlier on, that you're pricing carbon up until the date of net zero, and then suddenly the government has to start paying people to get rid of it, under a carbon take-back regime, you just take the fraction over 100%. And the remaining fossil fuel users of the world, and there will be plenty of them, remember those scenarios I showed you at the beginning of the lecture, are paying for net carbon dioxide removal. And that's much fairer, and I would argue much more robust than relying on taxpayers to do it. Because, as I say, taxpayers are always going to be vulnerable to politicians popping up and saying, let's spend the money on something else. Which brings me to my final puzzle, which is, I'm hoping you're convinced that this is at least an idea worth stroking your chin and thinking about. Why haven't you heard it before? Why aren't politicians considering this? And we have actually got remarkably close. So in 2015, a decade ago, Ron Oxburgh introduced a 2-line amendment to the energy bill before the Parliament in that year. Within 1 year of this act coming into force, the Secretary of State shall undertake a consultation on measures requiring extractors and importers of petroleum to contribute to the development of carbon capture and storage. And in his speech, where he kindly referenced the work of Stuart Hazeldine and myself. Basically, what we were proposing is this regulatory requirement. It's exactly what I've just described, on producers and importers to sequester or pay for the sequestration of a small but rising fraction of the carbon content of the fossil fuels they extract or import into the United Kingdom. Now, remarkably, at a time when climate policy was pretty divisive back in 2015, this was supported by all 3 major parties, including an eloquent speech by Matt Ridley, who had otherwise, several people laughed because you know who I mean, had otherwise been a very strident critic of climate policy up until then. They took it away for consultation, as is traditional, after such a bill is proposed in the House of Lords. I was taken out to lunch by a representative of Oil and Gas UK who spent an hour explaining to me what a terrible idea this was, and I spent an hour thinking, yes, I'm really onto something. But they deployed the dark arts and they won. In fact, what happened was Oil and Gas UK were smart enough not to oppose it themselves. They got Renewables UK to oppose it. They got the wind and solar lobby to oppose it by saying, wait a minute, all this money will go into carbon capture. What about us? And so they had they revised the amendment to pay for low carbon development. And then the Treasury just said, well, this is just a general carbon tax. It's nothing. So the whole thing died. They won. The empire struck back. But 10 years on, we are still working on this. Margaret Coper is another person I really want to give a shout out to, who got us close, arguably even closer in the Netherlands. She's another one who's been working tirelessly over the years to try and promote the principle of producer responsibility for fossil fuels. The new development now, and I really want to give them a big shout out, is Carbon Balance, an NGO represented here, who were set up specifically to promote producer responsibility for the fossil fuel industry. So to promote the idea of holding the fossil fuel industry to account for disposing of its own waste. And amazingly, there was no NGO out there. There were lots of NGOs out there saying, let's make the fossil fuel industry go away. Nobody out there campaigning for, let's just make them clean up their mess. And actually, it's a nice example of how, the history of carbon balance is a nice example of how these sort of lectures can actually be helpful, because I think it's fair to say that Myrta and Ingrid, the two founders of Carbon Balance, came to Oxford from a sort of more fossil phase-out background. We had a lot of conversations. We talked about these things a lot while they were in Oxford, and they went away and started an NGO, and they're doing very well. You can go to them. If you go to that QR code, you can sign up at Carbon Balance to find out about this and to stay in touch with our efforts to stop the fossil fuel industry from causing further global warming. And they've had some success. Between Carbon Balance and a couple of other NGOs, Bellona and the Clean Air Task Force in particular, worked very hard on supporting the Article 23 of the European Union's Net Zero Industry Act, which came into force just a few weeks ago, and it requires oil and gas producers in the EU to contribute 50 million tons a year of carbon dioxide injection capacity by 2030. A carbon take-back obligation it is not, but it is the first time that I know of where a climate cleanup obligation has actually been imposed on the fossil fuel industry, and this makes it historic. And what I also find interesting is I happen to know, because I was in a couple of meetings where they probably didn't know I was in them, the fossil fuel industry hated it. They can pay for it out of the coffee fund. This is a trivial amount of money, but I was in meetings where they were saying, and I actually raised it, I said, but it's not very much money, but it's the principle. So they know where this could go, and we've just got to keep on them. So when I started these Gresham lectures, it was when I accepted the invitation to do these Gresham lectures, 18 hours now on net zero. I think Aaron's comment was, who knew there was that much to say? It wasn't because I thought you deserved my wisdom. It's because I need your help. I've been on this shtick for 15 years or more, and I haven't been having much luck. And what I need is for people who are neither invested in stopping any action on climate change on the one hand, or specifically invested in a particular climate solution on the other, to get involved and contact your MP, as in fact one of you already did. Earlier this year, we nearly got a meeting with our Minister of State for net zero. I can tell you in the pub what actually happened. But thanks to Gresham, thanks to Jason Casey, a Gresham audience member. Thanks, Jason. And we will get the meeting one day, I hope. But we need members of the public who, as I say, are not sort of invested in either side of this argument to get in touch with your MP and ask, why is it that me, as a consumer, are having to scratch my head about how to fit a heat pump, which I'm not very well. I mean, this is something I'm going through at the moment. It's a hassle. When these massive industries have all the resources, all the expertise, all the access to capital they need to fix the problem. Why is it dumped on us? And I think if enough people start asking that question, we can make it that we are the last generation that allows fossil fuels to cause global warming. Thank you.